The coupon was creased down the middle from being folded and unfolded too many times. Marcus Reed held it out at gate B14 with the calm patience of a man who had learned, a long time ago, not to apologize for what he could and couldn't afford. The flight attendant looked at it, then at him, then at his daughter's small rolling suitcase covered in faded cartoon stickers. And she smiled the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile at all. "Sir, this is economy boarding. I don't think you understood the coupon." He understood it perfectly. What he didn't say, what he let her believe for the next 40 minutes, was that in about 90 seconds, every card reader in the first-class cabin was going to stop accepting payment. Not because of a system error, because of him. Marcus Reed had been standing at gate B14 for 20 minutes before his daughter. Ivy tugged twice on his sleeve and asked if they were going to make it. He told her they had plenty of time. He always told her that, even on the mornings when it wasn't quite true, because an 8-year-old shouldn't have to carry the arithmetic of a delayed connection on top of everything else she carried. They were flying to see her mother's family for the first time since the funeral. 14 months now. Marcus had booked the tickets 3 weeks earlier using a discount code from his credit card company, the kind of small, unglamorous perk that came standard with a card he'd had for years, and rarely used for anything except groceries and gas. He wore a plain navy jacket, slightly worn at the cuffs. He carried Ivy's suitcase in one hand and his own duffel bag over the opposite shoulder. Nothing about him announced anything, and that was, as it had always been, entirely the point. The gate agent her name tag read, Danielle took one look at the boarding passes when he stepped up to the counter and paused. "These are first-class seats," she said, in the tone of someone double-checking a mistake, rather than confirming a fact. "They are," Marcus said. Danielle glanced at the discount voucher clipped to the printout, the one that had covered the difference on the upgrade. She turned it over once, as if checking for something written on the back that would explain the situation better than the man standing in front of her. "Cute daughter," she said, not unkindly, but in the specific tone people use when they've already decided the compliment is doing the actual talking. "First class is a big treat for a trip like this." Marcus said nothing except thank you and took the boarding passes back. He had learned over the last several years that explaining himself to strangers rarely changed anything except how much energy he had left for the parts of the day that actually mattered. And today, the part that mattered was an 8-year-old girl who hadn't smiled properly in longer than he wanted to admit. Finally getting to see her grandmother, the flight attendant working the first-class cabin was named Whitney. She had the practiced warmth of someone who had learned exactly how much of it to spend on which passengers, and exactly how little was required for the rest. She noticed Marcus and Ivy the moment they stepped through the curtain divider, the slightly worn jacket, the stickered suitcase, the girl clutching a stuffed rabbit with one ear coming loose at the seam, and something in her expression recalibrated instantly, the way a hostess recalibrates when the wrong kind of guest walks through the wrong kind of door. "Can I see your passes?" she asked before they'd even reached their row. Marcus handed them over. Whitney looked at seat 2A and 2B, looked at the two of them, and said, with a small laugh that she clearly thought was gentler than it landed, "Oh, you're actually in first. Okay. Well, welcome aboard." She said it the way people say welcome to someone they've decided doesn't belong. Ivy settled into the window seat and pressed her face against the glass, watching the ground crew load luggage below. Marcus sat beside her and buckled his seatbelt, and for a moment in the quiet before boarding finished it felt like the trip might simply be a trip uneventful, ordinary. Exactly what he wanted it to be. It didn't stay that way. A businessman in seat 3 leaned across the aisle at one point and asked, not quietly enough, whether the airline had started letting anyone sit up front these days. Whitney, refilling a glass of water 2 rows up, allowed herself a small smile at that. The kind of smile that agrees with a joke without having to say anything out loud. When she came by to take drink orders, she asked the businessman if he'd like his usual. She asked Marcus, flatly, whether he and his daughter would like water. "I'll have a coffee," actually, Marcus said, "and an apple juice for her, if you have it." Whitney paused, just slightly. "Those are usually reserved for." She stopped herself, recalculated the sentence mid-air, and finished with, "I'll see what we have." She brought the coffee 12 minutes later, lukewarm. After two other passengers who had ordered after him, Ivy didn't say anything about it. She was old enough now to notice things, and young enough to still hope she was wrong about what she noticed. Marcus saw her watching the exchange, saw the small furrow that crossed her forehead, and reached over to squeeze her hand once. "You okay, Bug?" he asked. "She doesn't think we're supposed to be here," Ivy said quietly. Marcus looked at his daughter. For a long moment, "People are allowed to think whatever they want," he said. "It doesn't make it true, and it's not our job to convince them otherwise." Ivy nodded slowly, the way children do when they're accepting an answer more than they're understanding it, and turned back to the window. Halfway through the flight, the meal service began, and this was where the quiet dismissiveness stopped being subtle. Whitney moved down the aisle with the meal cart, describing the day's first-class entree to each passenger with the same rehearsed warmth: the herb-crusted salmon, the seasonal vegetable plate, a small dessert. When she reached row 2, she looked at Marcus and Ivy and said, without the description, "We have the salmon or a kid's snack box for her." "We'll both have the salmon," Marcus said. "She likes fish." Whitney hesitated. "It's actually a bit the portions are for the adult meal. I don't know if she'll eat what she orders," Marcus said evenly, not sharp, just clear. Whitney served the meal a full 10 minutes after everyone else in the cabin had already started eating. And when she set it down, she said quietly, but not quietly enough, "I do hope the coupon covered the meal too. We sometimes have to bill separately for those." It wasn't a question, it was a test dressed up as a courtesy. Marcus looked at her for a moment. He had spent a long career learning to read rooms, reading the difference between people who were simply doing their jobs poorly and people who were enjoying the particular power of deciding who deserved to be spoken to with respect. Whitney was the second kind. "It's covered," he said simply. She nodded, the kind of nod that files something away rather than accepts it, and moved on. The businessman in 3 chuckled again as she passed, low enough to seem private and loud enough to be heard. "Some people just don't know when they've gotten lucky," he said. Marcus didn't respond. Ivy, beside him, had stopped eating, her fork resting against the edge of her tray, watching her father's face for a reaction he wasn't going to give her. 40 minutes before landing, the real test arrived. The airline had begun rolling out a new payment system that quarter every first-class cabin equipped with individual card readers at each seat, meant for optional in-flight purchases, premium Wi-Fi, duty-free items, an extra bottle of wine. It was a minor convenience most passengers never used. Whitney came down the aisle with the small handheld terminal, offering the premium Wi-Fi package to each row. When she reached seat 2A, she held the terminal out to Marcus with visible reluctance, as though she already expected the outcome. $22 for the flight, she said. "Assuming you'd like it." "We would," Marcus said, and handed her his card. She swiped it. The terminal blinked once, and returned a small red arrow. Whitney's expression did something complicated, a flicker of validation crossing briefly under the professional mask. "It's declined," she said, and there was something almost satisfied buried under the practiced apology in her voice. "Would you like to try another card?" "That's strange," Marcus said, mostly to himself. He reached for his phone. But before he could say anything else, the terminal in the businessman's row 2 seats up let out the same small chime, then the 1 inches 4B, then 1A. Within 90 seconds, every terminal in the first-class cabin was flashing the same red decline message, one after another, like dominoes falling down the aisle. Whitney stood frozen in the aisle holding a terminal that had just rejected 4 different passengers' cards in a row. And for the first time since boarding began, her practiced composure genuinely slipped. What Whitney didn't know, what nobody in that cabin knew, was that the payment terminals weren't malfunctioning at all. They were routed through a merchant processing system that Marcus Reed's company had built 4 years earlier, when Meridian Sky Systems won the contract to modernize in-flight payment infrastructure for 6 major airlines, including this one. It was quiet, unglamorous infrastructure, Work the kind that never made headlines, the kind Marcus had built his entire post-divorce career around, rebuilding after he'd walked away from a much louder job to raise Ivy on his own. 30 seconds earlier, sitting in seat 2A with his daughter beside him, Marcus had received a routine automated alert on his phone, the kind he got several times a month, usually in the middle of the night, usually resolved by an on-call engineer before he even had to look at it. A batch verification error on the aircraft's onboard terminal cluster. Nothing serious, but this time, he happened to already be sitting inside the exact aircraft where it was happening. He hadn't caused it. He'd simply been the one person on the plane who could see it unfolding in real time, and the one person capable of fixing it from his seat. He opened the diagnostic app he used, maybe once a quarter, the plain gray interface that looked more like a spreadsheet than a product, and typed in the flight's tail number. 6 lines of terminal logs scrolled past. He found the corrupted verification token in under a minute, the same kind of small technical thread he'd once spent 6 years learning to pull at. Back when he was rebuilding failing companies, one loading dock at a time before Meridian Sky ever existed, he pushed a manual override. Whitney was still standing in the aisle, the terminal in her hand, trying to explain to the businessman in 3A that it had been notified. And it would just be a moment when all 4 red decline screens blinked back to green within the same second. She stared at her terminal. She looked at Marcus. He hadn't moved from his seat. He hadn't said a word. He was simply looking down at his phone, closing an app she didn't recognize. In the unremarkable way a person closes an app after checking the weather. Did you do that?" she asked before she could stop herself. Marcus looked up. "The terminals run on a system my company built," he said, without any weight in his voice at all. "There was a token error. It's fixed now." The businessman in 3 leaned across the aisle, his earlier amusement gone. "Wait, what company? Meridian Sky Systems," Marcus said. "We handle the processing infrastructure for this airline, among others." He said it the way he said most things, quietly, factually, without performance. And it landed in the cabin with far more weight than if he'd said it any other way. Whitney's face went through several changes in the span of about 4 seconds. First confusion, then the beginning of recognition, as she recalled, somewhere in the back of her training, the name of the vendor whose system every terminal on the aircraft ultimately answered to. Then something that had no clean name at all, the particular vertigo of realizing that the person she'd spent the last 2 hours quietly deciding didn't belong in this cabin was, in fact, one of the reasons the cabin's entire payment infrastructure existed. I had no idea," she said. "I know," Marcus said. "That was sort of the point of the coupon." He didn't ask for an apology. He didn't ask to speak to a supervisor. He didn't even bring it up again for the rest of the flight. What he did instead was turn back to Ivy, who had watched the entire exchange with wide, careful eyes, and ask her if she wanted to finish her salmon before it got cold. "Are you in trouble?" Ivy whispered. "No, Bug," Marcus said. "Nobody's in trouble. Eat your dinner." Whitney finished the beverage service in near silence, and when she reached row 2 again near the end of the flight, she knelt slightly beside Marcus's seat, no longer performing warmth, but something quieter and more honest. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I made some assumptions today that I shouldn't have, about the coupon. She paused. "About a lot of things." Marcus considered her for a moment. He wasn't interested in making her feel smaller than she already did. He had spent enough of his life on the receiving end of assumptions to know that the correction mattered more than the discomfort. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "But if you want to do something with it, the next time someone hands you a coupon at that gate, maybe don't decide what they deserve before they've said a word." Whitney nodded slowly. "I will," she said, and she meant it in the specific, chastened way people mean things when they've been caught rather than convinced. But Marcus had learned a long time ago that sometimes being caught was where the convincing began. The businessman in 3A didn't say anything else for the rest of the flight. When they landed and the seatbelt sign turned off, he stood, glanced once at Marcus, and said only, "Have a good trip," in a voice that had lost all of its earlier amusement. Ivy fell asleep against her father's shoulder somewhere over the last hour of the flight, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm, and Marcus sat quietly in the dark cabin, thinking about the small, unremarkable coupon, still folded in his jacket pocket. He hadn't needed to use it. He could have booked the seats outright 100 times over, but 3 weeks earlier, sitting at his kitchen table filling out the reservation, he'd used it anyway, not to save money he didn't need to save, but because Ivy had found it in an old junk drawer and asked, with the particular hope of an 8-year-old who didn't yet understand what things cost, whether they could use it for their trip. He hadn't wanted to explain to her, not yet, exactly what he did for a living, or why the coupon didn't matter the way she thought it did. He wanted her to have this a small, ordinary kindness she'd found and given to her father, unaware that the man receiving it had built the very system the entire cabin ran on. That, he thought, watching the clouds pass beneath the wing in the dark, was the whole difference between the way the world had judged him today and the way it actually worked. Nobody in that cabin had known what he carried. Not his job, not his loss, not the 6 years he'd spent rebuilding a life around a little girl with a torn-eared rabbit. They had only seen a coupon and decided that was the whole story. It rarely was.